Let's consider the death of distance. And when we talk about a futuristic consideration, we often refer to the famous quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And so when it comes to going fully remote into a virtual organization, we've often heard of the technology companies, we've heard of the one-off person that works in a cafe outside of the office, but truly having everybody move onto these digital platforms and work remotely is something very new. And so for the very first time during this crisis, we have everyone moving onto this platform that we have been developing for the last 20 years. Web technologies, remote connectivity tools, and all of that infrastructure that has been coming together. For the very first time, we have workers from many industries, across all professions, across many roles, coming onto this virtual environment. And if we think about educational institutions for a moment, consider students and professors going online, many of which may be well over 80 and are doing this for the very first time. And not just them, but the entire school ecosystem, the administrators, everything else that is carried about in the school is now being done online. Think about CEOs working 100% remotely, and their administrators and their staff and everybody else. And interestingly enough, I think the one thing that is very clear is that the technology works. That doesn't mean it's seamless, that doesn't mean it needs to develop further, but we can clearly see that it works. And I'll share with you here a story about a recent course that I gave fully online that was initially designed to be face-to-face. It was a week-long course with full days of teaching that was meant to be, as I mentioned, face-to-face. And this course went from being canceled to the government rethinking its policy about giving credit to an online course, to me having to transform that face-to-face course to a full online delivery. And ultimately, I had to think very deeply. I spent about 4 times the amount of time that I typically do on preparation and settled on a very interactive and different structure to each of the time blocks that I teach. Typically, they are from 1 hour to 1 hour and a half. And what I settled on was 15 minutes maximum of lecturing, talking, as I'm doing now, followed by a 15-minute activity and report out. And the reason I did this is because I knew I was going to be competing against Facebook, against email, against everything else that was working or taking place in that remote environment. And it turned out to be a pretty good structure. And although if you are looking at it carefully, you might have noticed that I was only lecturing half the amount that I would have lectured in a traditional classroom, ultimately the takeaways were much greater. Recall for a lecture format is only about 5%. And if you look at what we were doing here, they were certainly moving through recall, moving up to understanding and application, and within Bloom's taxonomy of learning, in many of the activities, they were applying, analyzing, evaluating, and even creating new knowledge. So although I covered less, the takeaways were much greater. The other thing I should mention as well is that the technology didn't fail me. I was able to use Zoom and I used it in its entirety. I used the breakouts, I used the visual feedback by students, I used polling, I even piped in music during the breaks, and it was a very solid platform, as many of us have found out. I also used Dropbox that connected seamlessly onto my file system, so coordinating and posting and all of the workflow that needs to happen traditionally with a course was only limited to what I was doing anyway on my own machine. I then shared those links directly from my file system onto Google spreadsheets that I shared with the rest of the teaching staff. In addition to that, we use WhatsApp to keep a separate channel of communication in addition to what was taking place in the course environment, and that was only for the teaching staff. I used other types of survey tools that were richer, and I was supported by a number of other interactive type tools that were more technology specific. But overall, we were very happy with the performance. Now, the other thing to note as well is that although this might seem very novel, we have been doing versions of this for quite a long time. Think about how many people you know in the organization that you work on. In my case, I probably know 100 people at MIT, and there are well over 20,000. So this is certainly less than 1%. And there are many people, and I'm sure it's the same case for you, that I've had relationships with for quite some time, working relationships, where I've only known them by speaking to them on the phone or exchanging emails or other those types of relationships that we use to carry out our work, but we never actually meet face to face. And when you think about the big global companies like the global consultancies that might have 100,000 employees in India and several other 100,000 groups distributed throughout the world, 99% of these people never meet. And so we're already doing versions of this. So the notion of 100% remote organization that has no buildings and where everybody works in a distributed fashion is not that ambitious. An organization that has no borders, that has no need for visas, that when you have to hire new talent, you're not limited to your region. You can reach out across the world. And those that are trying to offer their expertise don't have to move to the cities where everybody wants to be, the San Franciscos, New Yorks, Boston, and others. And so this is a very advantageous scenario when it comes to looking at some of these advantages. The other thing as well is, I often like to ask my wife, if you could live anywhere, where would you live? And I like to tell her, think about a Star Trek-like scenario where we could teletransport ourselves. Those are fun considerations, but if you think about the amount of time people spend commuting in the big cities of the world, in New York alone, millions of people wasting hours a day in that mode of transportation. If you look at Tokyo, if you look at many of the other big cities around the world, you have the same type of loss in productivity. And so this notion of having a virtual organization, potentially attending a school like MIT without ever leaving your hometown, is a very realistic scenario. And if we want to look at an extreme example of this, currently working and that has been going on for at least 20 years, is open source products or open source organizations. The Linux operating system, for example. These organizations are creating the backbone of what the most valuable technology companies today use. And in fact, they are the most valuable companies, period, as they are in the top 10 when it comes to the market and valuations. And these organizations are creating products without really having a traditional corporate structure. They're not paid salaries. They're loosely connected throughout the entire world, and they're creating high quality products. In fact, it is widely known that the productivity of open source products is about 100 times more productive than that of its counterparts in enterprise computing groups. So it is a very good example to study as to how to have this resilient, robust, distributed global workforce that is loosely aligned yet highly performant when it comes to creating technology applications. And so in general, I'll close here by making some observations about culture and change. Although we're seeing many successes, it doesn't mean it's very easy. Many are stumbling. It's hard to change ultimately overnight. And you'll need mentoring within your organization. You'll need acceptance. You'll need your workforce to go through that cycle of change. But if we can manage it, there are many great skills to carry forward. At the very least, we will have a stronger way of working globally, and a great opportunity here for technical leaders to make their organizations more efficient. Now, this will only improve. We're pounding on that infrastructure. We're leveraging all of those tools. We're pushing on the boundaries. So certainly we can look forward to even better tools in the future. Virtual reality that many companies have been working at, and certainly the big players in the technology industry are doing as well, are providing some great examples of what that future may be. And even before the crisis hit, there were already examples of being able to attend a sports event virtually in a virtual stadium while actually seeing the actual game. Same thing is true for movies. And when it comes to education, the opportunities that are afforded in this new virtual environment and this new mixed media type of platform are potentially transformative. And so let's consider that future, and I think I'd like to end here with a positive note of saying the best is yet to come.